one of the reasons I think why war and literature go so strongly together is because the basis of all human drama is moral choice, and there is no greater moral choice than in warfare. And no writer really faced greater moral choices than Vasily Grossman, and I was going to talk about Vasily Grossman's Life and Fate. Now, Life and Fate is the great, not just the great Russian novel of the 20th century. As you might guess from the title of Life and Fate, it is a deliberate act of literary homage to war and peace. And in this particular novel, this huge, sprawling novel which he wrote, the Sturms are really the modern version of the Rostovs. And you hear right from the start the way that Grossman is actually developing a very dangerous theme indeed in the Soviet Union, and that is that communism and Nazism were reflections, that they were mirror images of each other. Now, this, as you might imagine, was absolute anathema. And he wrote this particular novel, and he felt, basically in the early 50s, and he felt that after the thaw, or during the thaw under Khrushchev, that he would actually have the opportunity of publishing it. Anyway, it caused absolute terror in the publishers when they saw it. And it was immediately handed over to the department of the Central Committee, headed by Viktor Suslov, because they were so panic-stricken. And Suslov declared this novel must never be seen for 200 years. Now, that is probably the greatest piece of literary criticism that any writer could possibly hope to achieve, and certainly in the Soviet Union. Grossman died in total poverty, of stomach cancer, often brought on by stress, as one might imagine, and never believed that his novel would ever see the light of day, because the KGB turned up at his flat, and not only did they seize, did they arrest his manuscript, they actually went round to his secretary's flat and took every single piece of carbon paper and the typewriter ribbons in case somehow this novel could be reconstructed from those little elements, which gives you an idea of the effect of literature on the Soviet Union at that particular stage. In any case, Grossman thought that his novel had been lost, but in fact he'd forgotten that one particular copy had been loaned to a friend, and it survived in a haversack under some coats hanging up in a dacha, and eventually it was smuggled out of the Soviet Union in the 1980s and was finally published in the West. And it's now being published in virtually all countries, I think, almost all countries of the world. Anyway, that, I think, should underline the importance of this particular novel. It wasn't a finished one. There are obviously still elements which I'm sure Grossman himself would have liked to have changed, would have liked to have corrected, but he never got that opportunity. And anyway, if you ever get a chance, I do assure you it is well worth the opportunity of reading it. It's a large book, that is certainly true, but I don't think you'll find yourself ever bored by it.
Yeah. And of course, the other moral is always keep a copy.
Yes.
Preferably somewhere else. The only book I wanted to talk about is not actually perhaps one of the great novels. It's Olivia Manning's The Fortunes of War. But Antony was talking about a book where you have to make a moral choice. And of course you can always make a moral choice, but very often people are swept into a war. They have no choice. And I think this is particularly the experience of Harriet Pringle in The Fortunes of War. These are basically two trilogies, one called the Balkan Trilogy, where Harriet goes with her husband, Guy, to where he's teaching with the British Council in Bucharest first. And then they're pushed out, the Germans, you're constantly feeling the Germans getting closer and closer. They're pushed out from there into Greece, they witness the fall of Greece, and then go through to Egypt, where again there's this sort of, she details so much the sort of wonderful, it was a very strange, glamorous city, Cairo, but at the same time, she didn't want to be there. And she describes people having a lovely, glamorous time and other people going through tragedies and men fighting on the Western Desert. And ultimately she didn't want to be there, and it's quite extraordinary to me how well she describes all these different things. And very much that feeling of exile and the feeling of just wishing you were home. So there's war in all its different bits. And now we're just going to briefly think about revolution, which is another but far more painful. I mean, war is quite bad enough, but usually the enemy is defined. We know who the enemy is, and we feel justified in hating him. But of course, in revolution, it's something that splits families. Now, Maaza, your novel was set in a revolution.
Yes.
Did you have to address these sorts of problems of families, kind of?
I did. I mean, in fact, the novel is centered on a family, and the two brothers are on completely opposite sides of this revolution. There's one who's a pragmatist who only wants to keep his family, his wife and daughters safe, and there's another one who is a real revolutionary and joins an underground resistance group and is on the front lines in every sense of the word. It's what happened in Ethiopia. It's what happens in every revolution. It tears families apart. And again, the moral issues, I think, with revolutions become even more complicated because we're dealing with family, and you're forced to sit across the table and eat dinner every night with someone that you are ideologically opposed to. And again, it's those small intimacies of conflict that I think it's fascinating as a novelist to explore that.
Yeah. Lara, do you have any particular
we were talking earlier about our favourite revolution books, and I was thinking about Lampedusa's The Leopard, his story of Garibaldi's movement towards unification in Italy, which I wondered, and I think there are people here who would have more to say about on this, and maybe we could hear from you about whether we can see it as paralleling in some way Rushdie's Midnight's Children. But I think there it's interesting because it's not that one generation is torn apart. It's really this sense of the younger generation as the revolutionaries, and Tancredi coming along and being this sort of good-looking young man who's in a way going to save his family from decay by sort of marrying outside and bringing in this beautiful sort of, the kind of product of the abolishing of classes. But at the same time, the sympathy of the reader is primarily with the Princess Alina and his sense that a sort of a world that has been built up over centuries is being kind of swept very carelessly away. Does that seem to chime with other books that we can
yes, we were thinking also about how revolutions are such an intimate, difficult thing that actually the best books about revolutions are usually written by foreigners. You were talking about the Spanish Civil War.
It's certainly true of the Spanish Civil War, but even also of the Russian Revolution. Some of the most interesting novels, Victor Serge and so forth, were written by outsiders. Victor Serge had sort of certain Russian parentage, but he'd been brought up in Belgium and so forth. But he was also a double outsider in that he was in with the Bolsheviks, but at the same time was very much more of an anarchist by instinct. You also can get another sort of outside version in, for example, Novel with Cocaine by Gaev, which is an extraordinary portrait of the collapse of society in Petrograd. Total, not just social disintegration, but dissolution in every form of the daughters of the aristocracy, basically trying to survive through prostitution or becoming the mistresses of commissars, and basically trying to forget the pain and the horror and all the rest of it through drugs. So one can get that sort of totally nihilistic aspect. But going back to the Spanish Civil War, there you do find certainly the split between families, between, say, one brother and the other. Funny enough, much less so in the Russian Revolution, I think. But I mean, that's just sort of a sort of an instinct of what one has seen of that particular upheaval. But the Spanish Civil War was something which, in a way, had to be written about by outsiders, because I think it was just so intensely personal for so many Spaniards that they found it very difficult.
Too close.
No.
Yeah. When you were talking about revolution, as a Dutchman, the first thing I think of is not of splitting families, but the Dutch Revolution in the 16th century. One of the first revolutions ever done, and followed by 80 years of war. But there was not a question of splitting families in those days.
Because you were throwing out a foreigner.
That's right.
We
were fighting against
Spanish. There was a national revolution.
Yeah.
So from that point of view, it's different from, let's say, the French Revolution, where, I mean, the only novel that I could think of, again, perhaps not the, is Hilary Mantel's A Place of Greater Safety, which is an extraordinary, sort of rather messy book that's going in all sorts of different directions. But I can't think, I'm very prepared to be shot down in flames about this. Sorry?
Tale of Two Cities.
Tale of Two Cities, that's another good one. Yep.
Madame de Stael.
Madame de Stael. Yes, but you see, these are all...
Oh, French ones, is it?
Yes, is there a French one?
Yeah. I do believe the Mantel is...
someone's got one. Who was that? Sorry?
Well, we'll wait till it's coming.
Zola, maybe.
I do think Mantel is, in comparing her to A Tale of Two Cities, Mantel writes completely under the allegiance of history. I think I can say that, and so deeply connected to archival research that if it's not in some document, she doesn't put it in the book. She tries to make up very, very little. And whereas obviously Tale of Two Cities is a completely different...
That's a sort of stage setup. It's about isn't it, for an exciting story.
Yeah.
Yes, almost to the point of Baroness Orczy and the Scarlet Pimpernel, but not quite.
Right. And another thing I wanted to add to your comment about that it's usually foreigners who are writing books about the revolution. I think that's correct in terms of there is a geographical distance that some people need to have in order to look at this. But what I have started to see also is a kind of generational distance that has to happen. When you have a revolution, the people, it's not the generation, let's say, it's not the people who lived in it, the people who were adults at that time. And it's not their children who also have memories of that. It tends to be the grandchildren who have the distance that time allows, who are the ones asking questions that their parents don't want to answer and their grandparents don't want to talk about at all. And I've seen that a lot. I'm wondering about the type of stories that we will get coming out of Afghanistan and Syria and Egypt. And I wonder if it will take a generation or two to have these revolutions told in a type of fictional form.
Probably
I'm interested
they will,
to watch.
I'm sure, because such deep and intensive emotions that are involved, you have an incubation time for that, and maybe that is 2 generations later. It's going to go on.
War novels seem to come out much more quickly when you think of sort of Marbus and Le Feu and others of, say, the First World War or even sometimes Second World War.
And the poets writing in the trenches. I mean, maybe that's...
It's more immediate in the sense.
That's true. We haven't talked about poetry. Off you go.
Well, then if you talk about poetry, you talk about the First World War, where about 2,000 poets were published in England alone.
That's extraordinary.
Yes, it is.
The trench poets.
I think that, is there something about We're really thinking on our feet. This is a bit terrifying, but
Off the top of our heads, yes.
about trench warfare. I mean, it is that lots of those poems were written in dugouts,
Yes.
and it was a sort of an experience that seemed to lend itself to poetry. Where the Second World War, to me, seems a war in England that kind of lent itself to short stories.
Well, interesting, actually, I think most of the poetry in the Second World War came either out of the RAF, as airmen, or often in
Which is
a sort of similar context.
Yeah.
But the home front literature, first of all, was short stories, and there were lots of articles in Horizon saying, where are the war poets?
Yes, where are the war
Quite
poets,
anxiously, sort of thinking, were they all killed in the First World War?
Yes, yes.
While the First World War one was either shooting or writing.
Yes.
In those trenches.
But I think also it was a unique experience. Nobody had really fought an entire war, at least the Western Front bit, in trenches. That was something that nobody had had to really face, that kind of horror.
Well, there was quite a bit in the American Civil War. Interestingly,
Yes.
not a huge amount of poetry, as far as I know, really came out in that particular way. But
I think also, obviously the First World War, the other thing is just the class thing, that this generation of, that suddenly the officers are the ones in most danger, they're the ones going over the top, they're also the ones who've been to public schools and learnt about poetry, and are young men who are in their poetic phase, and suddenly we get this flowering of poetry, and it's a slightly different generational context in the Second World War. Which kind of, I mean, maybe we should sort of pull back to that question of why a bit more, of sort of what are the stories these wars enable? Why is it easier to...
Also, we haven't yet talked about War and Peace, of course, which is sort of a novel that's had huge repercussions. Maybe we don't want to.
well,
I think it's sort of got to be addressed. We've got to go there.
no, but War and Peace obviously is a slight hybrid. I'm sure Andrew Wilson will have one or two comments on this in a moment. But anyway, I mean, it is a slight hybrid with the historical lectures at different points.
Yes, when Tolstoy gets up on his
trying to
soapbox.
sort of argue his anti-leadership version of war. But at the same time, if you can ditch that, you have got obviously one of the most gripping novels.
There was your point about also that
Well, the characters.
affections,
What's
the
interesting, in fact, is that the characters based on real life, Kutuzovs and others, are frankly not very interesting in War and Peace. The wonderful ones, of course, the totally invented characters. And I think this should be a lesson to all historical novelists who are tempted by putting real characters into their novels. Anyway.
Go ahead.
Just thinking about what war does for writers, sort of how it enables... In War and Peace, it's very much that it enables change for those characters.
Yeah.
And the kind of the novelist writer, I mean, I'm very conscious now of sort of that Booker Prizes in Britain tend to go to people who come from places in which more dramatic things happen. It does feel like novelists have a hard time forcing that change, or forcing sort of more to be at stake without something like that, and that's what gives it its kind of power as a novel.
But you mean the sort of what Hollywood would call the arc of character through experience, of the way that sort of character is transformed through experience.
Yeah, I wanted to go back to what you were saying about Tolstoy. I mean, two things that I think is interesting. The work of a novelist in relation to history is, in a way, to transgress the territory of the historian. Sorry. And it is a deliberate crossing of boundaries. And you know, what's so fascinating to me in War and Peace is the way that Tolstoy is able to tell you exactly what he thinks through his descriptions. I mean, novelists have to have, it's the eye that's judgmental, that will paint the picture and give you, they're manipulating your opinion without you even realizing it. For example, his portrayal of Napoleon, which is in many ways very close to what Napoleon looked like. But Tolstoy these are some of the details he mentions about Napoleon. He had plump little hands, fat thighs, short legs, and he walked through a room leaving a trail that smelled of cologne. He had a rotund stomach, and I can't remember what else, but just in the details, which are true in a sense, but just giving us those details tells you what Tolstoy thought. He thought that Napoleon was pompous, and when you juxtapose that description to the devastating impact that Napoleon had on war, you get this really interesting dichotomy between this short man with fat thighs and the type of war that he waged. So it's a pompous kind of megalomaniac that he's developing here with just these descriptions. I'm interested, though, in your comment about writers not putting in historical characters, because I think that those are the most fun. I would like to get them started. Go ahead, Otto.
Do you do you have, do either of you have real historical characters?
Yes.
And could you talk about how you did that maybe a bit?
Are you ready?
She's not going to allow me to
Come on, Maaza.
I do. I've used and I am using historical characters in this new book, but in order for me to get into the character of Emperor Haile Selassie, who was deposed during this revolution that I write about and eventually killed, what I have to do is find a way into him that kind of strips him of his emperor myth and really gets to who he might have been as a man. So my focus is on trying to find one scene or one moment that I could depict that allows me to get into his psyche during the revolution. And I felt perfect freedom in doing that because it's fiction. And because my allegiance is to storytelling and not to history.
Right, now at this point, sorry.
Well, the only thing I want to add is that as a novel writer, don't try to be an historian. That's dangerous.
Yeah.
You have to do your research very well and very good and very solid, but you have to forget it after you have done it. And when you write, don't write an historical novel. Don't do it.
Yeah.
Because then you are part historian, part novelist, and it's, I think it's not the best of things.
Yeah.
We've got slightly off the track. Now, I think it's probably time for some questions. Would anybody like to offer us? Yes, gentleman there. Oh, you're next.
Hi. I wanted to ask, to what extent do you think that the fluctuations in political supremacy among some countries is responsible for the spread or trivialization of certain kinds of war literature from other places?
Sorry, I didn't. Could you say that a little bit more slowly? It's a bit boomy.
I asked, to what extent do you think that the fluctuations in the political supremacy among some nations is responsible for the spread or trivialization of certain kinds of war literature from other nations?
Right, the spread, I mean, I can
You mean
understand.
the influence from one's country to another of literature on war?
Yes, or were you thinking of a particular sort of the fluctuations in one country will set somebody off thinking about it?
That's not what I meant. I meant as in certain superpowers or certain countries prominent in the scene at a particular period of time.
Yeah.
How does that affect the spread or trivialization of war literature from other nations which may not be in importance at that point of time?
Right. Do you have an idea?
I
Still haven't entirely
No,
got
no,
it,
no.
but
I think it's
You are too difficult for us.
I'm sorry. Yeah, it was quite a complex question, which I'm so sorry. Now, the gentleman in the red jersey there. That's it. Just there.
Hello, yeah. When a person writes a novel with historical characters in it, as Antony Beevor cautioned against, isn't there a danger of manipulating with history? I mean, it would be a nightmare for historians down the ages who might read the book, and I mean, that writer might have fiddled with some characters, some manipulated them
yes.
according to their.
He's longing to answer your question.
Now listen,
I mean,
there are many historical novels which I think are a bonus to history, because novelists can go in areas where no historian should ever dare go, which is speculating about the thought processes or whatever it might have been. My only worry is when you cannot tell what has been invented and what has been not been invented, and what is genuine. Now, the fact that it's got novel written on the front of the book doesn't necessarily help, because the trouble today is so many young people all over the world find it very, very hard to distinguish between fact and fiction. I mean, it's terrifying the way that, for example, as I mentioned yesterday, when Dan Brown was published in Britain, half the population believed that, you know, Mary Magdalene had had a child by Christ. So, I mean, you know, one does wonder in an age, particularly which may even be a post-literate age, and we're getting into an age where the moving image is king, that people cannot distinguish between the two, and this is really my sort of sole worry. But I can think of many historical novels which are of huge importance in helping one sort of look at a different period of history, or different periods of history, from a totally different point of view, and that is very, very healthy. I do not agree with Neil Ferguson saying that all historical fiction is an aberration or is a corruption. That is totally wrong.
But then you have writers like E.L. Doctorow with Ragtime,
Yes.
that involves historical characters, and E.L. Doctorow does not do research on his book, not in any way the way that Hilary Mantel does. But I think the beauty of that book is the way he's able to convey an era or a moment in American history. So whether J.P. Morgan really was this eccentric, or whether Henry Ford really did do the things that he said he did, it doesn't matter to me, because as someone reading a novel, again, I want to be swept away by the book, and I do think, you know, I'd like to know some of the books that you think has dealt very well with historical characters.
Well, one is a very, very controversial one, and that is Jonathan Littell's The Kindly Ones, Les Bienveillants, which won all those prizes in France, but also provoked huge anger and controversy elsewhere, because he was a Jew looking into the minds of a SS Einsatzgruppen officer and trying to understand that mentality. Now, as I was saying, that is an area where no historian should dare to go, and I thought that was very courageous, but also very original. So there are definitely examples like that. I'm sure you can come up with some, but...
Yeah, I feel like we're getting a bit away from...
That's right,
yes.
Let's take another question. Yes, gentleman with a cap.
My question is very simple. Like, as a reader,
Can you speak up?
Sorry, can you speak up? Yeah.
as a reader, when I am reading a historical fiction novel, through the characters, I am trying to revisit the history. But a suggestion was made by the gentleman on the left that like an author in a fiction can take liberties with the historical facts. Knowing little bit, I always pick up a historical fiction, knowing little bit of the history and trying to revisit my knowledge of it. But when I see conflict, I may not be able to catch the plot or appreciate the writing. What are your comments, sir?
So I think your question, as I understand it, is when you read a historical novel, you don't actually know what to believe, what is right, what is true, what is correct.
I know background of the history, but the characters, I am revisiting the history. But if I think...
So as you read...
What I'm saying is that when I'm reading a historical fiction novel, I pick up a book, I know a little bit of the history, or through the characters you have created, I am again revisiting and reinforcing my knowledge.
Yeah.
But if you take liberties on the facts of the history, as a reader, I may not be appreciating, or there might be conflict between what I know and what you're trying to project.
I think those helpful italicized notes can be the
That's right.
yes. These people are real and these people aren't, and this is, and I think with, I mean, you know, we were talking lots of the novels. There's sort of such a difference between the postmodern novel and the sort of carefully researched novel that readers. The question, I suppose, is how much work can you expect of readers to sort of to know the background or to know the kind of novel they're reading, and that's a much bigger question.
I mean, I think the very fact that it's putting a question in your mind, that at that moment you're reading it and you're thinking, yeah, well, hold on a moment.
Yes.
I mean, if that then makes you go to your library, look it up, do some more research, I mean, that's great.
Yeah.
But of course, the novelist, that's not the job necessarily of the novelist to sort of they're giving you a taste of history, as it were, rather than a history lesson.
Right.
Gentleman next door.
This is to Maaza, the Nastalin. There is a difference between the European revolutions and the Derg regime revolution in your country. The European revolutions have lot of documentation evidence available for the author. How much research could you do for your Derg-based novel? And at the same time, how much element of research is there, or is just a kind of thinking that you have done in your novel?
So how much research did I have to do?
Because there is no published evidence for Derg regime and the revolution, as I know, in Ethiopia.
What happened when the regime that took over during the revolution, the dictatorship, fell in 1991, and guerrilla fighters that had been in the mountains fighting came into power in 91. And what they did when they came in, because they wanted to look good, there was a brief in that time when they released a lot of information, a lot of footage, a lot of photographs about that era. I was able to find some of those. And then they put them under lock and key again. But there are books, there are accounts that I've read, but I was also able to talk to people who were directly involved in that. So a lot of the research was sitting down and talking. But when I wrote a date down, it mattered to me that I had it right. When I wrote a location of an incident, it was important to me that I did that right.
Perhaps in relation to that, we should talk a bit about the difference between war novels written at the time and war novels written later. It feels like the kind of research.
You were, after all, able to interview a lot of people who, were there. So ultimately, their testimony was hugely important and valid.
Talking about the time gap that needs to be there. People are just starting to talk about it now. And so I was able to find some of those. And they were college students at that time, but now they have children in their 20s, and it's the first time they're starting to speak of it. So I talked to them.
Yeah.
And maybe that the sort of what is it that makes people able to talk about it at the time versus later? I'm just thinking about the Second World War, the kind of the German literature of the war.
Yeah.
There was an enormous gap compared to the British literature, which came out quite quickly. And in Germany, it feels like there were so many factors preventing it at the time, the sort of sheer chaos of the carpet bombing, apart from anything else. But and then afterwards, it was a question of how you confront the question of guilt, which somehow seems to have taken a generation.
There was not much difference between the First World War, the literature coming out in Germany, as after the Second World War, because after the First World War, Remarque was the first one, Im Westen nicht Neues, who did that after 10 years. And Robert Graves, Goodbye to All That, also after 10 years. And I think the literature in the Second World War was
the poetry
about, Heinrich Böll and so on. They came also after 10 years.
Yeah.
But before that, of course, you then had the Sven Hassos, which was the pornography of war, which sort of came in almost straight away in the early 50s.
Right.
But the real reaction in Germany, funnily enough, came in the beginning of 1979, in January 1979, when that mini-series from Hollywood, Holocaust, with Meryl Streep, was broadcast in Germany. And that was the one which really sparked the debate, which had been simmering in academic circles, but had not actually reached the wider population. And that's when I think that a lot of the fiction started to develop.
There were a whole series of sort of rebel novels coming out in the late 40s in Germany, but sort of more disparately, and it had still taken a few years. So it feels like there's no one apart from the odd diarist kind of writing with a pen in hand in an air raid shelter, where there was in Britain. What in Holland? This diary collection that you know?
Only the woman I was talking about, and Anne Frank, for instance.
Yes.
But it came out after a long period of time. There are...
and do you think, because you would expect more in Holland in a way, because they were on the right side? I mean, the problem in Germany seems to be that they were on the wrong side.
But it was an occupied country, which is slightly different from the Allies who were at war. That was a different situation. Occupation.
But in France they came out straight away. When you think Silence la Mer and the great French novels of that particular period. But also, I mean, as I mentioned with Simone de Beauvoir complaining, that every single novelist was coming up with another novel of the resistance, which was sort of gloomy and existentialist and basically deeply irritating. But in America, I noticed that some of the novels came out that much more quickly. I mean, Owen Shaw, I can't remember when The Young Lions was published. It was pretty fast, pretty soon after the war, yes.
Yeah. Let's take another, we've got some more questions. I'm going to take one, there's a red sleeve over there, very revolutionary.
There's a red sleeve behind, yes.
Let's have your question.
Hi. Quick question. War literature does at times hold up the horrors of war. Do you feel it can sometimes also hold up or even glamorize things which shouldn't be glamorized? I'm thinking specifically of Gone with the Wind. It celebrates a way of life.
Of which war?
Of Gone with the Wind.
Gone with the Wind.
Yes,
Gone with the Wind.
it
So
celebrates
that is
a
a
way of life.
romanticization
Of slavery, with the mammy and,
That's right.
the slaves in the fields, everybody's happy. It's a way of life, I understand, the Deep South. But there are also some aspects which shouldn't really be glamorized, so to speak.
That's right. I think that there is a sort of dark glamour about war.
Yes.
You can't get away from it. War also is very erotic. You have a whole lot, particularly, for example, I mean, the war I know about in Cairo, you have a lot of young people, young men, young women, the young women are working as cypherines, as secretaries. There's an enormous, great GHQ there, which is, doing, sort of orchestrating the war over the whole of the Middle East. And these young men and women, it's like being in a kind of incredibly glamorous magazine novel. A magazine. Everybody is focused on the work of winning the war. But at the same time, there's parties, there's dances, there's affairs, and as you said, this wonderful phrase in your book, the futureless present. The futureless present in which all kinds of rules can be broken.
But I think that question of glamorizing, I talk quite a lot about my book about these Second World War writers, much in that situation, in a sort of erotic pocket of time. And I've talked about that in England to quite a lot of audiences of people who were alive in the war, who sort of come up to me and say, there was no erotic pocket of time for me, I must have missed that bit. And I think you just have, part of the problem, and I think you're right, is that stories are always going to take the most interesting bits, and there has to be drama. But it's the good thing, as you said, is that they're kind of, what was your great phrase about? It's not a.
I had a great phrase.
It's a bit of history. It's not a history. It's a. Artemis has forgotten her great phrase, but she had one just now.
I had a great phrase and now I've lost it. I believe this.
But it's a little snapshot and has to be seen as that. And perhaps the problem with Gone with the Wind is that it's not a snapshot, it's a sort of enormous epic. I mean,
but also, again, it's a stage set, isn't it? I mean,
But there's one other aspect is, of course, war is such a mass activity. And here one is focusing on the emotions of people within it. And actually it's almost like the magnifying glass in the sun. I mean, it's actually sort of burning through this magnifying glass in a really intense way.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the glamour of it, I think a really, really good example of the way that we forget really the devastation and the violence of war is in the figure of Che Guevara. And, there are T-shirts now of him with his beret, and many people wear that T-shirt and don't know who he is. It just looks good and it's trendy. But I think one of the best biographies ever written of him is by John Lee Anderson. He has a book called Che Guevara, A Revolutionary Life. In terms of stripping the myth and giving you the man in all his complexities, and this man who was not afraid to shoot men within his own army, who was not afraid to do that, point blank, who felt that he had very hard lines. He drew very hard lines of what is right and what is wrong and what you're allowed to do and the consequences if you did not follow rules. This is not a man that would would be comfortable with the image that's being made of him right now, of this romantic figure. But it connects very directly to what we assume is a revolutionary character. And all we think about is the kind of red-blooded, passionate figure, without understanding that the consequences of that is often very bloody.
You could say that about Lenin, for instance, as
Yes,
well.
yeah.
He's a sort of a hero, a revolutionary hero, a philosopher, a writer, but he was the one who said, to make an omelette, you have to break eggs. And he had quite a few eggs broken before he went his way, and he was a very cruel man.
Yes. But I mean, the whole emphasis on sort of charismatic leadership is one of the great elements, in a way,
Yes.
of war literature.
Yeah.
Those that focus on the sort of some of the main leaders. And when one thinks, for example, of Dr. Zhivago, I think one of the great characters there is sort of Strelnikov. And the idea, which was very much the Russian Bolshevik idea, of sort of romantic ruthlessness, the idea that you could, through sheer cold-bloodedness and killing, you were forging a new world for the future.
Yeah.
Now we're going to take another question.
Yes.
The lady there,
And one right at the front.
and one right at the front. You're next.
Hi. Oh, can you hear me? Okay. So when you're reading history, we're kind of taught to look at what kind of historian is doing the writing, what kind of perspective they might have.
Sorry, could you
speak up a bit?
It's a bit boomy, so if you can talk quite slowly, as if we're incredibly thick. That's going to help.
Okay. When you're reading history, we're taught to think about what kind of historian is doing the writing, whether they're a Marxist historian or a revisionist, or what kind of perspective or bias they might have, what kind of argument they're making. Do you think the novelist has to take sides or have a perspective on the war they're writing on, even if they're dealing with the interior worlds of people?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. For those of you who didn't hear it, it's basically when you read a book of history, you sort of know whether you're going to be reading a Marxist historian, a right-wing historian, whatever. Whereas in the novel, perhaps you're not quite so clear. Am I saying it right?
And does the novelist
have to declare him or herself? Anyone?
I don't think a novelist has ever to say something about his convictions or whatever. No, he's writing, and you don't see exactly if a novelist is right-wing, I would say.
You shouldn't.
You should.
It can become pretty clear.
It can become pretty clear, but I don't think it's the job of the novelist to sort of, it should come out. It should, I think the more freedom that you give your reader, surely the better the novel is going to be, or at least the more...
Obviously there have been many, if you like, propagandistic novels, which are bound to sort of reflect the political views. I mean, one can think in the Spanish Civil War, people used to say always that history is written by the winners. Well, actually, the Spanish Civil War is a very good example where history was written by the losers, actually, because it was written so much better than the winners. And it had when you think of Hemingway, Dos Passos, and everybody else, with a sort of support for the Republic.
Ring the Bell Tolls is a good example of a novel that seems to manage to convey a message whilst not being sort of problematically didactic. I think we don't need to say it should avoid a message. It's just whether you can pull it off.
Well, and I think also as a novelist, you have to have some level of sympathy for even your most unsympathetic characters. I think that's the only way you can render them in any type of complexity. If you are able to look in your book or look at the characters that you are setting up in your novel and say, well, these are the good characters and these are the bad ones, you haven't really begun the book at that point, because what's interesting about war are the moral crises that we've talked about, and what war forces people to do sometimes. Good people do bad things, and bad people have moments of redemption. And if you can look at the characters and say, this one is on the other side of history. This is on the wrong side of this war, but these are the qualities I know I can sympathize with, and you render that. You've created a more complicated character. It doesn't mean that you don't have a judgment as a writer, but I truly feel your task as a novelist is to complicate every character, because that's how we are as human beings.
I think we've got one question at the front.
One more question in the front, the lady there.
Hi. So actually I've been thinking about this since yesterday, also the talk on the renaissance of non-fiction, and thinking about how there is also the same thing going on, it seems, with the movies. And if you're looking at our Oscar nominees this year, a lot of them are based on, you know, true stories. And today you talked about artistic license, and I wondered how you felt about history in the movies, and if there is more of a responsibility or less so, because there we don't really have a book cover that says fiction or non-fiction. And obviously the audience for movies is even greater, sadly, than books.
Anything to say on this? Or? I think we'd better leave Antony to do this one.
I really wanted to hear Antony's point of view.
Oh, very good, very good. Okay.
I mean, it's very rare to find any decent movie about war or revolution, in my view. I mean, it's very hard, and the reason for that, I think, is quite simple. The needs of the cinema industry, of the movie industry, are totally incompatible with good history. Now, whether they make a great story or not is a different matter. But even so, you know, when one's, you know, we're often consulted on or asked, you know, what's your view of the best movies that have ever been made about war and all the rest of it? The answer is there are actually very, very few. I mean, you know, the Battle of Algiers, La Bataille d'Alger, or something like that. There's another French one, in fact, from the Indochina War, which I think is superb. But when you start looking at sort of, you know, Saving Private Ryan, ye gods, I mean, talk about every movie cliche and every character conforms to central screenwriting. You know, you have the redeemed coward, you have the cynic reduced to tears. I mean, everybody has to go through that Hollywood arc of character. Frankly, it's so predictable that actually Artemis, in fact, refuses to go to any movie with me because I'll be grinding my teeth and she'll find it totally...
Well, it's the war movies. We manage on the thrillers.
Okay, yes, it's true. Come on, somebody else.
I was just, I mean, in relation to your earlier point about small, intimate moments being the things that make books good, I think it's the same with film. And not even intimate moments, but Downfall, the story about Hitler's final days, I thought was extraordinary.
And it was a lot. I mean, it was a lot better than most. I agree.
Perhaps we'd better end on that.
But one insistent question is still coming. Yeah.
Okay. For the podium, I would like to have a Western and African viewpoint. In the dialogue, we are just confining ourselves to war literature of last 100 years.
Sorry, what was the last?
100 years.
Apart from the Iliad,
and
in the last 100 years.
The theme is war literature. We're just looking at the war literature of
the period that's been most fertile, the period of war that's been most fertile to...
From Indian context, I'm seeking your views from what you see. India has a war literature going back thousands of years, and if you're aware, that's Bhagavad Gita. Mahabharata. So we have a war literature. Are you aware about that?
Of the Mahabharata.
What do you think about that war literature? Because that has become it's basically a literature originating on a war background, but has become a part of her life. I'm expanding the context of the discussions over here.
Oh, right.
I think we'll have a wrinkle down there, so maybe you need to answer that question in private afterwards.
I think that's for another session, I think. Yes. We'd better call it a day.
We're on.
Anyway, thank you all very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.